Hi, guys, and welcome to the Write Your Legend podcast. I have a special guest on today that I'm really excited to interview and ask some questions that a lot of you guys like to listen to and you ask me about. And I think these are some popular topics that you are going to love when it comes to your subconscious mind, personal growth, attachment styles that you've probably seen yourself in or some of your partners in as well. And I'll get you better in regards to your relationships, dating, and with women, as always. So no further ado, I have someone on our podcast today. Her name is Thais Gibson, and she is an amazing, amazing woman, and I'm so happy to have her on. She is an author, speaker, and co-creator of the Personal Development School. You should take a look at her website. It's pretty good. I really do like it. So she is extremely passionate about personal growth, the subconscious mind, and connecting with others. And she has 13 different certifications, ranging from CBT to hypnosis. Thais strives to continuously learn and grow. And that's why she also does a lot of contributing work in regards to research and attachment theories that a lot of you know a lot about when it comes to your adult romantic relationships and attachment trauma that we talk so much about on this podcast and on my YouTube channel as well, and as hers. So I just want to take the time to welcome you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here with you today.
Yeah, I'm so excited that the guys and the women that do listen are going to love what you say. You have great energy, so I know that it's going to shine through in regards to this. So thank you again, once again.
Likewise.
So I wanted to kick it off in regards to a couple things. You know, one thing that I noticed, and because you talk a lot about the mindset, your subconscious mind, your conscious mind as well, and how relationships can contribute to our thoughts and our energy and our personal health, I think, as well. One thing that I've noticed is when we start to either get infatuated or obsessed somewhat over the idea of someone, this triggers a lot, I think, of codependency attachments, but also triggers a lot of what I would like to call illusional thinking, because we get into our fight or flight mode. Do you notice those patterns happening in people in your practice or with clients that you've had before?
Yeah, absolutely. And like when a lot of people are getting into a position where they're experiencing this, so like extreme infatuation, and I'm sure you're familiar, it's like also called limerence.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea of limerence is that we can get so connected to something. And what I found the three underlying reasons are number one, because somebody subconsciously is like, the subconscious mind basically wants to derive its sense of identity and create wholeness through other people. So just like we see kids who get attached or identified to their toys, or just like we see adults who get identified to their house or their car or their romantic relationships, we use our attachments to try to derive a sense of wholeness. And so when we have repressed traits in our own subconscious mind that somebody is expressing, so let's say, for example, we are not very good with our boundaries and we're not very assertive, but we meet somebody really assertive. The subconscious mind, when it doesn't trust itself to set its own boundaries or be assertive, will usually feel very attracted to assertiveness in others. Mm-hmm. And it's actually trying to create a sense of wholeness through what it's repressed by identifying with somebody else who expresses that trait. And so when somebody has really repressed traits and somebody else expresses them, that's one of the constituents that will create limerence in relationships. So that's number one. Another one is if somebody's meeting our deeply unmet needs. So like, let's say you haven't had physical affection in a very long time, somebody comes along, gives that to you, or you're not getting words of affirmation, somebody gives that to you, that will create limerence. And then we also get limerence because of a subconscious comfort zone. So if somebody reminds us of our earliest subconscious associations for what love is, like, oh, this person has mannerisms like mom or dad, or things that those are our first interpretations of love. Then when somebody in our adult lives expresses them, those are the three main ingredients that I found to create limerence. And then we really get into that like obsessive attaching and wanting to derive ourselves through other people.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I talk about number 3 a lot. Can you reiterate for the listeners just like what's 1, 2, and 3? Because I know this will definitely help them so much and be like that, oh, wow, aha moment.
Yeah, definitely. So number one, and this is usually one of the most potent ones, is if somebody is expressing your repressed traits. So the things that we learn are not okay or don't get our needs met in childhood, we'll often associate with negative emotions, then we repress into the subconscious. So if we learn that like as a child, we have an authoritarian parent and we can't express our boundaries, and so it's like, oh, boundaries are bad, they get me punished or they get me in trouble, I'm going to repress my assertiveness to gain love and connection. And then we think that that's a bad thing, but we need wholeness. The mind is designed to equilibrate and try to create wholeness. Then we'll really seek that out in others. And so when somebody else expresses it, we're like, whoa, and we get all attracted and infatuated. So that's number one. And that can also show up in a negative way as like our shadow. We can get resentful or frustrated by that as well. And then number two is somebody meeting our deeply unmet needs. And so the bigger a need is unmet and the more somebody meets it, the more infatuation and like intense attraction we'll have. And then number three is our subconscious comfort zone. So if somebody has mannerisms, behaviors, makes us feel the way that a parent made us feel, all those sorts of things, we get really attracted to that too.
Yeah, that gives so much clarity on a lot of like relationships that I see, you know, especially number two. You know, sometimes when we go outside of our marriage or go outside of our relationships because we're looking for someone else to fulfill a need because we're not getting it within our own marriage. And so we get very obsessed with the idea of this person and we wonder why. And we think, oh, we're so in love with this person. But if we truly examine some of the reasons why we do go into those relationships, it's a lot of times because they're offering something that our partner is not offering anymore at that certain point.
100%. And I've done so much work with clients in exactly those ways where like people are coming in saying like, oh, I'm questioning my marriage. I'm really attracted to this person at work, things like this. And it's like, if we get them to identify what needs the person's meeting or what traits they have, and then we get that person to work on expressing those traits and making the piece, like becoming more assertive, for example, like integrating into the wholeness, those traits in themselves, and then asking for those needs to be met in their current relationship, literally the limerence goes away for people.
Yeah, I believe that so much. I also believe attraction can be, you know, attraction is a choice. Like I always say that attraction is a choice, right? I do believe attraction is a verb. I have a whole course around attraction, and that's something I talk about so much. Is attraction is a choice and as well as a verb. It takes action, right? To grow attraction, to be attracted in some way, mentally, physically, emotionally, whatever we call it.
100%. And I think too, like there's like a difference between being attracted to somebody versus like attraction. And so if you're in a place where you feel like, oh, you know what, I find that person attractive, or I think it's interesting, for that to turn into like feelings, we have to like be on that train unconsciously, like going with the train, like feeding it, thinking about the person, buying into it, instead of consciously being like, hold on a second, something's pulling me in that direction. Let me investigate it, see what feedback that's actually giving to me about what's not whole within myself or what's missing in my marriage or relationship, do the work, and then literally we take something away from it instead of just going on the runaway train, and then we're in limerence and like addiction to somebody in our thinking and all these different things.
For sure. And there's a lot of addiction around love and a lot of addiction around other things too. And I think that is a co-creation of it because, you know, like you said, before you get on the train of attraction, basically, we got to figure out why. And that's really, really, really important. So what is it in regards to, and I know you talk a lot about this, and this is why I kind of want to bring it into like dating and relationships, especially. So now we just kind of hindered on, talked a little bit about relationships, but now I want to kind of go into dating when it comes to the how our mind is hit with dopamine. And like when we have that instant rush, when we have those butterflies, and we have those first initial dates, or when we start to really grow attracted to someone, where maybe those thoughts kind of take control of us. So I always, like, for example, what I'm trying to say is, I always tell clients, like, when you like someone and you see that you guys are hitting it off and vibing, right? It's okay to be excited and think about that person so much. But then on the other hand, where we lose ourselves is when we overthink things and we kind of put them on the quote unquote, what I would say to for easy purposes, is the pedestal, and we forget and we don't look at any red flags, and we just focus on that dopamine hit that we get from our brain, right?
Yeah. So what I find is like all of these, I love talking about this stuff. So like what I find is that one of the first things that happens is people, when they go into those dynamics, so you have this mechanism in your brain, it's called the reticular activating system. And basically it's
what is it called again? I'm sorry.
Reticular activating system. So RAS. And basically its job is to be like the filtering system of your brain. And it filters out according to what you're already putting focus and attention on. So like a really clear, simple example that most people will be able to resonate with, and that's often used to describe this, is like if you are thinking about buying a new car and then all of a sudden you see that car driving everywhere on the road. It's because you've been like thinking about it and focusing on it and these sorts of things. Now, your RAS also works on behalf of your needs. So if you have this like hugely unmet need and somebody comes in and is like meeting that need, your RAS will start filtering out red flags because it's prioritizing getting that need met. And so we can get into a position where like we literally ignore red flags. And then on top of this, the more unmet needs we have, or the more traits somebody's expressing that we're repressing, the more we have not just dopamine, but we have oxytocin, which is our bonding neurochemical. We have something called phenylethylamine, which is like the attraction neurochemical. And so we have all these things combined. And literally we can get into a position where we are like losing ourselves because our reticular activating system is actually trying to filter away things that we need to be looking at from a conscious perspective. So if we can remember that and we can consciously like step out of that, then that can be very, very beneficial. And also your brain will get its needs met in the present if it can, but if it can't, it will get its needs met in fantasies of the future or in memories of the past. And so then we can get into this position where we get lost in the future and the past, because when we think of, oh, this person, they're going to bring this to me or they're going to meet these needs, we actually elicit little emotional responses and neurochemical reactions. And so we get our hits through thinking about that stuff. But the problem with that is that then we get we get so enriched in the fantasy of somebody that we lose context, and we put all these expectations on people as a result of getting addicted to this like one-sided fantasy about how perfect the person is. And those expectations usually get let down later, especially in the power struggle phases of a relationship. And then it becomes really problematic.
Yes. Wow. This is like music to my ears. I love it. How do you know, by the way, because like I didn't even I give you an introduction, but I didn't even ask you, like, how is it that you found out about all of this? What did you do to know like the way that, because I love this scientific, geeky, nerdy stuff. Like I geek out on this stuff so much, especially on videos. I was like, I got to stop myself. How did you learn all this?
I think I just researched like crazy. So I think a lot of my learning started like in a spiritual way. I was in school for psychology and all the traditional stuff anyways, but then I like got really into the spiritual side of things. And then I kind of had this like obsession with finding spiritual things and seeing that they were working for me so much and trying to understand like neurochemically and neuroplastically what's happening. So then I was trying to bridge like science and spirituality a lot. And then I was in school for like traditional psychology. So it led to all these different like certifications and different things, but I think I was trying to like bridge things together, and that's where a lot of this comes from.
Yeah, a similar story. Yeah, I was same thing with me, spirituality. And then I was like, I'm obsessed with the human mind. I think it's such a power. I feel like it's something we haven't even tapped into, like 20%, not even 20% of the human mind. That's why like, I seriously, I geek out before I go to sleep, and I'll like surf the web and just read things about the brain all day long.
It's amazing. It's really amazing stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to know, so tell me a little bit, and that brings us into like attachment theory, something that I know you specialize in and you talk a lot about. How does attachment theory impact like romantic relationships?
Yeah, so the analogy I love to give to people is like literally our attachment style impacts our relationships in a similar way that like if you're going to sit down and play a board game with somebody and they have a totally different rule book for how the game works, that would be synonymous to like how, or analogous for like how our attachment styles work. Like we have different, and so what we found, and like we've created this thing called integrated attachment theory, which I was originally working in my practice, and I probably still had some like personal boundary work to do as a human when I started my practice. And so I was seeing like 50 people a week, 60 people a week for like a long time. And I was like, well, I need to set some boundaries. But people would be like, oh, please, can you see my brother? He's in pain, you know. And, you know, I had some personal boundary stuff to figure out.
I think we've all been there, yeah.
Yeah. So
as
when
coaches, because we want to help everybody, you know.
You know, and like you love it too, so it makes you excuse like certain things, and later you're like, hold on a second.
Yeah.
So basically what I started doing is, before I was actually doing any attachment theory work, I was doing a lot of like subconscious reprogramming work with people. And so we found like all these specific core wounds that people had. Like you can kind of boil things down to like 22 major core wounds, like I am bad, I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable, I'm alone, I'll be abandoned, I'm excluded, I don't belong, I'm disliked, I'll be rejected, I'm not good enough, like these kinds of things. And so, and I also noticed that different people had different like emotional patterns. And I didn't realize until then I started doing more work around attachment theory and more research that actually like specific attachment styles, they don't just like impact our adult romantic relationships from like a temperament perspective, which is what like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth's work originally talks about. They actually, like every single attachment style actually has like specific core wounds that they have challenges with. They have specific emotional patterns. They have specific needs and expectations in a relationship. And I noticed that they have specific love languages. So when you look at like Dr. Gary Chapman's 5 love languages, they actually tend to have like specific ones they resonate with.
Yes, that is so true. It's so true. I see that all the time. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so we created like this idea of like integrated attachment theory, which is like, here's your attachment style and here are the core wounds, emotional patterns, expectations they all come with. And this is kind of like your rule book for your board game of life or for your board game of relationships. So we found, for example, that like dismissive avoidance, who I'm sure lots of your listeners know tend to be like a little bit afraid of commitment, afraid of vulnerability, distant, you know, these sorts of things. Well, they go through a lot of emotional neglect in childhood. And so they learn to have these core wounds that say things like, I am unsafe, or vulnerability is unsafe. I am defective, or something's wrong with me. And this largely comes from being a child and you grow up and you are wired for that attachment and closeness and to be emotionally nurtured. And when a caregiver can't give that to you, your childhood brain can't be like, oh, mom and dad are emotionally unavailable right now. Everything gets personalized. So instead that child goes, okay, I'm not getting my needs met, even though I'm trying and really wanting them. And so there just must be something wrong with me, or I must be defective. Mm-hmm. And so we see a lot of dismissive avoidance, for example, have a lot of shame in their adult lives. And part of why they're creating distance a lot is because they're afraid of people seeing who they truly are at the roots, and then believing that, oh, they're defective, and getting seen at that level. And so they tend to have those core wounds. They tend to have emotional patterns, and also core wounds around feeling afraid of being trapped, helpless, powerless, things like this. And they tend to have emotional patterns where they feel annoyed, irritated, frustrated, anxious, worried, these sorts of things, or numb. But then if you compare that, for example, to like an anxious, preoccupied individual, they're often feeling abandoned, lonely, sad, desperate, needy, like totally different emotions on a regular basis when they're triggered. And a lot of their core wounds are around being disliked, excluded, rejected, not good enough, unloved, these sorts of things. So we have like this whole, in a way, like subconscious web that affects our attachment styles. And what's really cool is, like I always tell people, the more specifically you can define a problem, the easier it becomes to reprogram it or to create resolution. And so when you have like your attachment style, but then you're able to boil that down into like, these are the core wounds, these are the needs, these are the emotional patterns, then what you can actually do is you can work on reprogramming the core wounds, expressing and communicating your needs, equilibrating the emotional patterns. And as a byproduct of all of that, you become secure so much more quickly.
Yeah. Sounds like some work that I had to do on myself too. I know that. Yeah.
So what was your attachment style originally?
Anxious attachment.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. From abandonment and things like that I had from growing up with my father and things like that. Yeah. I was definitely not avoidant attached. Like I was definitely anxious attached. I was full on.
I was very fearful avoidant. So I was like the hot, cold, like going back and forth.
Oh, no, I was head on. Codependent. So how about like, okay, so I love this because I know a lot of our listeners, a lot of my clients too, when I do more personal development coaching. Sometimes I'll do like quick 30-minute coaching in regards to their relationships, and then we'll do more coaching in the future, or do our personal development and packages. And one of the things that I always break it down, I mean, I always try to get to is the root, you know what I mean? And one of the most common things that I've seen is a relationship a lot of these men have with their father. Either they were non-existent, they were abandoned, or the father was completely opposite, was very loud, was very angry all the time. He always had to get approval from his father and things like that. So I see both sides of the spectrum. And sometimes it depends on what happens with their mind and how they want to perceive themselves in the future as an adult. And sometimes they become that person, or they go completely opposite and they become very nice and they take advantage, they get taken advantage of from women. They pick the wrong women, or they think that their art and getting attraction is in their doing. If I get, then I'm going to give, you know, a lot of that unhealthiness thrives through it. So for the listeners that are listening today, and if they wanted to do some work at home in regards to how to kind of retrain this and how to start, what were some suggestions that you would tell them what they can do at home to kind of get to the root of figuring out what their attachment style is, number one, and then number two, how to get to that root? Like, what are the either questions they have to ask themselves? What do they have to do?
Yeah, I love that so much. So I would say one of the biggest things is like what we can look at our lives and we can ask ourselves, like healing really happens when we become our own parents. So when we become and we give to ourselves everything that we didn't get that we really needed. And when we, how trauma really imprints the subconscious mind is through actually the meaning we give to experiences more than the experience itself. So for example, if we get hurt and we make it mean, well, it's because I'm unworthy that happened, or it's because I'm unlovable that happened, that actually has more of an impact on how we carry trauma and how it stays alive. And like from like a neuroplastic perspective, this is the craziest thing, is if you have any wound right now from something that happened in childhood, you had to still keep firing and wiring that set of neural pathways over and over again in relationship to yourself for it to still be affecting you now. Mm-hmm. So what we have to recognize is like anything that we have that we are still carrying from a time long ago, even if long ago is a year ago or months ago or weeks ago, we are basically in a state of re-traumatization in the relationship to ourselves. And so we have to ask ourselves, and people can dump on a piece of paper right now. You can ask yourself, what are the painful events that happened to me that I still feel emotion around? And what did I make them?
Probably, right?
Pardon me?
Or that you choose to ignore.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And then you can ask yourself, what did I make those things mean about myself? Mm-hmm. And you can write everything that came to mind, and you can really pull from like core wounds as prompts. So you're not good enough, you're unlovable. A lot of the things we were mentioning earlier. Some of them that I didn't mention were like trapped, helpless, powerless. I am disrespected. I am stupid. I don't like that word very much, but it's what a lot of people will give meaning to. And so you can write like, what are all the stories I told about myself? And then what are the stories I told about other people? And I'll go into like reprogramming in a moment and what you can do with that. But then on the other side, if you can imagine, you almost like make a set of columns and split it into two. You can ask yourself, what were the greatest unmet needs from childhood? Because trauma, in the words of Dr. Gabor Mate, are the things that happened that shouldn't have happened, like abuse, violence, anger, these things, and the things that didn't happen that should have happened, like emotional neglect would be a form of trauma. You didn't get emotional nurturing, and that should have been given to you. And that, in fact, is traumatic to not have a really basic human need. Mm-hmm. And so you can write down, what are all the biggest needs that I didn't get met that I needed to get met? And then what you do is you can split it into two activities. And this, like, irrespective of your attachment style, we can talk about how to identify your attachment style more in a moment too, but these are like the underlying components that will create security, is healing these factors to begin with. And so the needs, your job is to write strategies out for how to meet those needs in your relationship to yourself, and strategies out for how to ask for those needs from others. So maybe you look and you go, I was emotionally neglected. Okay, well, what we'll always see is that unless you've already been doing the work in healing, if you were emotionally neglected in childhood, chances are extremely, extremely high that you're in a state of still neglecting your own emotions. Mm-hmm. And this is what we see, for example, in dismissive avoidance. They were emotionally neglected, and then they don't feel their feelings. They repress their feelings. They try to numb their feelings, everything they can. And that's a state of re-traumatization. You're keeping those issues alive. Mm-hmm. And you're firing and wiring those same neural pathways over and over again. So of course they're still there. But if we can replace that with a new way of operating, and then we can remove this old way of being, neural pathways atrophy over time, just like muscles weaken over time, and we can create new neural circuits on another side. So we can go, you know what, I am going to spend 1 hour a day doing Vipassana meditations and journaling about my feelings, like whatever it is that you want to create as a strategy. Your job is to meet your unmet needs. And then the other side of it is your job is to change the stories you're telling yourself on a regular basis. And just like we know, thoughts, if we can change our thinking, and we can even do like thought interruptions, like say cancel when we catch ourselves telling an old story, and upgrade to like a cognitive reframe that's a healthier version of that original story, that's very beneficial. But you can also use, and this is probably my favorite tool for reprogramming because it goes really deep, it's something called auto-suggestion. I'm not sure if your listeners are already familiar, but basically your subconscious mind is like really suggestible for the first hour that you wake up and the last hour before you go to bed. And it's because your brain is producing mostly alpha and theta brainwaves. And so you can sit down with a journal during that time, and especially before you have coffee, because coffee puts you more into beta mode. And so you can sit down and you can, whatever your core wound is, like I'm not good enough, I'm unloved, whatever your painful story is, the language of the subconscious is imagery and emotion. So when we try to just change our thinking or do affirmations and you're like, I am loved, I am loved, I am loved, it doesn't really, it's like your conscious mind is still just only speaking to the conscious level. But if we can look for evidence and memories, all memory is colored with emotion. So if I can go, I am loved, and here's a piece of evidence. And you think of your best friend or your partner or a friend of yours, and you can picture in your mind that person and the way they looked at you, or the way they hugged you, or the way they called you back late at night when you needed something. The more specific pieces of evidence we have, we're actually in that suggestible state early in the morning or late at night. We're actually using our conscious mind to speak to our subconscious mind in a way that's in imagery through the memory or the thing we're visualizing. And every memory has that emotion attached. And so it's actually imagery, emotion, and then repetition that reprogram the subconscious mind together. So if you can bring those ingredients together and you can like work on a core wound and you're like, I am good enough, pick 10 pieces of evidence on a daily basis in that state of suggestibility early in the morning, late at night, or even like after a meditation or when you're in a relaxed mode. And that's actually going to reprogram your mind extremely quickly.
I love that. That's great. I've never heard of that.
Oh, cool. Okay. Auto
I've never heard of that. I love that.
Look it up or read about it. But yeah, it's an amazing tool. And it's so funny because we hear a lot about like affirmations and stuff like that, but it's kind of surface. Like it's kind of your conscious mind speak, like you can imagine your conscious and your subconscious speak two fully different languages. And so it's like your conscious mind trying to reprogram your subconscious mind by speaking Spanish when like your subconscious mind speaks English. So we have to like get our conscious mind into the habit of actually speaking through imagery, through pieces of evidence, through emotion, and then rinse and repeating. And that's how we actually do the reprogramming work. And it speeds up our healing dramatically.
Yeah, I'm a big believer. Like when we have clients, I'm not a big believer in just being like, do affirmations. You know, I always say we need a journal. I feel like journaling is the most, that journaling changed my life. I mean, I've meditated, I have a theta healing certification, like I've done it all, right? And I somewhat can do readings on people at this point, but one of the biggest things in regards to that is I can do readings on myself, but the most prominent thing that has always showed up in my life, and I think it's just coming down to the neuroscience of it all, is journaling. Because when we write and we read it back, it's two completely different ways that we're viewing it than when we're writing and when we're reading back, right?
Absolutely. And it's so beautiful too, because it kind of puts you like into that sacred relationship with yourself when you're journaling. Like you're being with yourself, you're feeling about yourself, you're listening to yourself. Like there's all these really important components that I think bring healing as well.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why I like that. And that's why when I have the guys do some journaling around like trauma, personal development, and some amazing things, you know, I always tell them, like, once you journal, when you read it back, give yourself those two affirmations that you didn't give yourself when you journaled, right? So what didn't you speak of, or what was relatable? So meaning like, oh, I don't feel the common one, I don't feel good enough because she's not giving me attention, right? So then what would your affirmation be? Let's write about that. And then the affirmation should be, I don't need people's attention to feel good enough. And that's your day for your day. That's your affirmation, because you've already journaled about it. And so that's what we do.
It's like a really good cognitive reframe for them.
Yeah, that's what I try to do. Like I don't talk much about it, but I know more about it. And it's the cognitive behavior. Like I try to change the behavior. Especially with the men that we work with. And I talk about cold showers. I think cold showers are the most brilliant thing. I mean, It's better than drinking coffee. It's like when you get highly emotional, I found myself in this state once, and like everything I have to try out before I give to my clients, you know? And I just remember, you know, long story short, and I think I'm going to share it on one of my videos, but I went through something very personal that I know can help with women. I mean, excuse me, that will help men going through this with a woman, but I took a cold shower. And I was in the midst of crying. I was a little sad, a little depressed probably. And I just took a cold shower. And you go through so many emotions when you take a cold shower. Like you get angry. Why am I doing this shit? You know, you get so angry and you're like cracking up because now you're angry at taking a cold shower. You're like, this is freaking cold. And then you're laughing. Then you start crying. You go through so many emotions because what's happening subconsciously and consciously is you're training the brain to tell them that you're in control.
Yeah.
Right. So it gets you back to the present moment. And I think those things work as well. And I love cold showers. Just
absolutely. My business partner at the school is like obsessed with that stuff. He's like a Wim Hof instructor. So he does like all the cold, he does these like ice baths in the middle of Lake Ontario in the winter, like all these things. So maybe one day I'll try all that stuff too.
Yeah, I haven't done the ice baths yet. I don't know if I really, that's
I did one once, but it wasn't in the lake. It was like in an actual space and it's pretty intense, but yeah, good experience for sure.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Yeah. I get cold thinking about that, especially in the snow and like the cold weather. Wow. But your body is so powerful and people straight up are just like, how do you not get sick? But your body is like so powerful. Your mind is so powerful. I mean, when it comes to your body. So
I think one other thing too that's so helpful for people when they're trying to emotionally process is like one thing that was so important for me to learn as a human is the only reasons we're in emotional pain or suffering is because either we have pain, which is unmet needs, and like that's a good thing. Like that's how we survived and evolved for so long. Like we had hunger pains and that was a cue or a feedback mechanism to get food, or we have our thirst to quench and we seek water. Like, you know, we feel disconnected, we seek attachment or closeness. And like, so pain is always a signal that we have unmet needs, and pain should never really be more than like a 5 out of 10. Mm-hmm. Suffering is when we're telling a story about those unmet needs. So it's, oh, you know, I'm feeling disconnected maybe because let's pretend, you know, Bob's feeling disconnected because it's COVID and he's quarantined and he's isolated. So he's going to feel pain. But then if he starts storytelling and goes, I'm going to be alone forever. This is never going to end. You know, I'm not good enough. That's why I don't have connection. You know, I'm unloved, like these sorts of things. Then we get into suffering. And so whenever somebody's going through something, I always tell them like, this is your like thought processing tool. Sit down and be like, I start with my suffering and I question my stories. So, you know, you might be sitting going, oh, I'm going to be alone forever. Quarantine will never end. Can you 100% know this? And do you have equilibrating pieces of evidence? Like, what are some reasons that's not true? What are some reasons you are good enough or you are loved? And then once you've kind of calmed down and emotionally regulated from ironing out your stories, then you ask yourself, okay, and what is my unmet need right now? And what's my strategy to get this need met? So it's like change your thinking, meet your needs, and this will really help as well to emotionally process a lot of the stuff.
Exactly. And then that's something I talk about so much. And I'm so glad you said that because that comes down to emotional control. I talk so much about emotional control when it comes to attraction, and especially with women. Women are going to be attracted to a man that has power in his emotions, meaning he knows the proper times to show the vulnerability. He knows the proper times to not release anger in different ways, right? So that comes down to getting your needs met through emotionally, because then we can get emotional control. When we have emotional control, what happens? People respect us. We respect others. Then we become the leader. And if we become a leader, some part of this with men, this can also be embraced in their masculine presence. And this is what makes a woman feel safe. And so like, that's how I break this all down to them. Mm-hmm.
I love that. And also like, we don't blow up our lives. Like it's when we don't have emotional control, like neuroscience has proven every decision we make is based on our emotions. Mm-hmm. So even people who are like, no, I'm a logical, rational thinker. Like everybody's actually making emotionally based decisions at the tipping point. So if you're not in control of your emotions, then you're not in control of your actions. And that's when we get into like really intense self-sabotaging stuff as well.
So true. Yeah. How about let's give them a recap of like what some of the attachment theories are and what they kind of mean.
Yeah. So basically like what I can share with people who are really trying to identify their attachment style, if they don't already know, are basically some patterns. People usually really see themselves and or their loved ones in these patterns. So the first one is somebody who's secure. And like a secure person, obviously in childhood, they get a certain amount of eye contact, emotional nurturing, their needs are met consistently. They grow up in a safe environment. So basically the beliefs they grow up with are people are safe, vulnerability is safe. I am worthy of love because they get love without having to be or do anything. And that love is consistent enough. So they actually develop a greater sense of self-esteem and feeling like they can trust and that they have confidence in themselves and relating to others as they grow up. And so they also feel like, okay, my needs can be met through others. I deserve for my needs to be met through others because that was actually their subconscious comfort zone of their experiences. So the secure person in their adult lives feels comfortable expressing themselves, feels safe in vulnerability, feels like connection is a good thing, feels like their needs are worthy, feels more confident, all these different things. That's obviously where we're trying to get to.
Exactly, because those are two different, the child secure and the adult secure. Just want to emphasize on that. Yeah.
And then
because when we're in that child dynamic, we don't have to come from that child dynamic to be that secure person. What Theus is just giving us is she's just giving us the child secure and the adult secure.
Yeah, and a lot of like what the childhood programming is, but you're touching on something really important, which is like people can be secure, excuse me, in their childhood, but they can go into a painful or abusive relationship in their adult lives and become insecure because the subconscious is reprogrammable through our experiences and through repetition and emotion of what we're exposed to. But somebody can also be insecure, grow up, do the work, and then become secure at the same time. So it goes both ways.
Yeah.
So those are the typical like childhood patterns and then the adult manifestation. And then in dismissive avoidant, like we sort of briefly touched on, there's emotional neglect. There can be physical neglect and it can be like, you know, extreme neglect. But a lot of what I find is that dismissive avoidants are sort of like, it flies under the radar where like, they'll be like, I had a great childhood because maybe their needs were met and they had a safe environment, but they don't necessarily realize that there was a lack or something missing because they didn't have that emotional availability and attunement from caregivers who are like talking about feelings, bringing up feelings, all these sorts of things. And so the adult patterns you'll often see in this person are things like fearing commitment, fearing emotional closeness, definitely fearing vulnerability. Sometimes they can be really charming and charismatic, but as you get closer to them, they're like, get back. And they can sort of have that inconsistency there to a certain degree. And then there will also be people who tend to carry a lot of internalized shame and they won't show it and you won't see it unless you're like, you know, really digging into them and having a conversation like in a client sort of facing, or if they're showing up and doing the work on themselves. But there usually tends to be a lot of like feeling shame, shaming themselves, these sorts of things. And then our anxious preoccupied, who's sort of like the opposite end of the spectrum, and they often attract each other, which is so interesting, of course. Yeah. And so the anxious preoccupied is usually somebody in their childhood who has inconsistency with their caregivers. So maybe one parent's really warm and one parent's really cold, or maybe they have like some connection and they build in positive associations to connection, but then there's a lot of, you know, challenging dynamics in connection as well. And so they basically learn, oh my goodness, like I want connection and I'm really afraid of feeling that abandonment. And they assume or perceive that they're being abandoned every time there's inconsistency. Mm-hmm. So they grow up with these core wounds around feeling super afraid of abandonment, super afraid of being alone forever or lonely, wounds around exclusion, I don't belong, I'm disliked, fearing rejection. And then they usually make that disconnect mean I'm not good enough. Mm-hmm. And so often they will really try to overcompensate in relationships and be overgiving and obviously have some of the codependent tendencies as a byproduct. So that's our anxious preoccupied. And I'm sure people can sort of identify where they are. And then our last one is our fearful avoidant. And sometimes fearful avoidant is referred to as disorganized or anxious avoidant. But basically this individual tends to grow up with more trauma and fearful avoidants can they really experience both ends of the attachment spectrum. Yeah. But it's the attachment style associated with trauma and trust really being broken in their childhood. So some examples could be if somebody's like a parent's an alcoholic and it's like you love the parent, you want to get close to the parent, And you feel like you can be close to them sometimes. So your subconscious builds in like positive associations to connection, but then you never know when mom or dad are going to drink. You never know when they're going to be using, or you never know like what's happening. And so you love, but there's no consistency that allows you to trust. And this can also be if there's violence in the home, if parents are fighting a lot, things like this. It's like you love, but you can't trust. And so this individual grows up and they have both sides of the attachment spectrum, and in fact, both sets of core wounds. So they have the anxious side, the fear of being alone, fear of being abandoned, fear of being excluded, I don't belong, these things, and the fear of getting too close, being trapped, being helpless, being powerless. And they often shift back and forth from one side to the other. So they can like be more in their anxious if they're with someone more dismissive, or more in their dismissive if they're with someone more anxious, because they're kind of like polarizing each other to get that balance. But they often will feel like, you know, in their adult life, it's like, come here, get close to me, get close. And somebody is closer, no, stay back, stay back. And it's like the come here, go away, push, pull thing, which is obviously so confusing for partners, but often also really painful and hard for that person. And they can have a tough time settling into a relationship and feeling safe in a relationship. And I am unsafe is another huge core wound for the fearful avoidant.
Yeah, that's huge. You know, it's funny because I'm smiling because I'm just like, me and my other head coach, Natalie, she usually does a podcast with me, but she wasn't here today, couldn't be here today, but she and I talk about this so much. Like, she had that type of attachment style, you know, the avoidant, dismissive. That's the one we were just talking about, avoidant, dismissive.
Avoidant, fearful, avoidant.
Yeah, fearful avoidant, excuse me. And then I had anxious attachment, and it's just so funny because it's the truth, just like by my upbringing and her upbringing, you know. And that's why she specializes a lot of addiction. She helps men with addictions and any type of addiction, you know, and it's a beautiful thing. And it's funny because we talk about this so much, and it just really comes down to how we were growing up.
Crazy. And fearful avoidants tend to struggle the most with addiction themselves, like numbing, because it's all this repressed trauma. I used to be a fearful avoidant before I did the work, and I went through addiction at a young age, like as a teenager. And it's like you go through all these things and you have all these emotions, and fearful avoidance as well, their attachment strategy is usually to hyper attune to others. Yeah. Because if you don't see consistency, you can't tell when mom's drinking or dad's using or they're going to fight or whatever's going on. The only way you derive some kind of safety in attaching is to be like super hyper vigilant. Like, oh, I'm going to notice everything that they're doing, everything they're feeling, any pattern changing, so that I can then adapt. And that's the only way I can find consistency. And so that makes these people grow up in their adult lives to be like really good at noticing patterns in people and like really empathetic because they're so tuned into others. But then they're usually like sponging up everybody's emotions, and they become this like emotional container at the same time. And then it has to go somewhere, and it comes out, if they don't have better tools, in unhealthy stuff instead.
Yes, it's so true. Oh my gosh, I can only if she edits the podcast. So I'm going to tell her to especially listen to this. Of course, she has to listen to them in order to edit them, but she's going to be like, oh my gosh, it's so true, because, you know, just hearing it. And like a couple examples are like, you know, just things that I know will help. And that's why I share, just to kind of bring light to things, you know? So sometimes she lives in California and sometimes she's here. And when I'm very in the zone, and, you know, it's a very busy practice that we have, and she's packing, and I'm like, she's like, my dress you took to the dry cleaners, but I don't have it. I'm like, I told you it was in my closet, go look. And she went, and she heard differently. And so I have numbers in my head that I have to remember because I have a call with my accountant in like 2 minutes, right? So I run to the closet and I'm like, it's right there. But my head, like, I don't see how I'm reacting because my mental space is trying to remember something. So then I can get back to it when I get to my computer, because I get distracted very easily, right? And so I get on the call with my accountant, and as soon as I come in, she's like, I hope you're not mad at me. I didn't see it. You know, I didn't see the dress. And I'm like, oh my God, because we know each other really well. I'm like, oh my gosh, I reacted differently, because she picks up on that stuff. She's very empathetic. She knows when patterns are off for me, like she'll trigger down on that. And that's how we complement each other too, because she's also healing and she's healed, right? So like, that's the difference, is like, here's the things, guys. The reason why I'm sharing this is because you can have a partner that comes from anxious attachment and then the fearful avoidant, fearful dismissive, right? The fearful
avoidant, like the really like, I don't like commitment at all extreme. So dismissive avoidance, and then fearful avoidance, so like both. So fearful avoidance, yes. Natalie.
Fearful avoidance. So that's why I'm saying is like, we can have those attachment styles, but then once we can use them as fuel for our relationships too, because also in this dynamic, once you become that secure person and do the work, it can actually complement each other. And that's why I wanted to bring that to the head, is because like those little things that I'm talking about, and then I know her, she knows me, I know the why, she knows my why. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I reacted because hold on. I just want you to know, like, I'm not mad at you. Now I look back at how I reacted. Just remember, when I'm in work mode, like I'm not there, like I'm not present.
Yeah.
And especially if you catch me off guard and you need something from me, I'm just not present. I will react in the most monotone, direct way ever possible because I'm not there. So it's the only way I know how to react, right? And so she's like, yeah, you're right. And she's like, I was so nervous that you were mad at me. I didn't want to disappoint you. I'm like, I told her none of that. That's not allowed. And she starts laughing, So it's really funny, And then another thing I wanted to share too is like when you were talking about the, what was it?
The dismissive, the neglectful one?
No, it was before we started talking about attachment styles. It was our emotion, something around our own, what do we call it? Hold on.
Oh, pain and suffering.
Meet your need. Changing, what did you say?
Change your thinking. Like the suffering is the story and the pain is the unmet need.
Yeah, the unmet needs. There you go. Thank you. So when we're talking about unmet needs, they can be big and they can be small, right? So here's the thing is like, the more that we work on ourselves and our internal growth and healing, it's constant everyday work, right? So when I first started with my healing, it was really bigger traumatic things like abuse and, bigger things. And then when I get into my practice, I'm still doing subconscious healing and like things like that are triggering me emotionally, right? So I say that because even the smallest things that stick out in childhood, right? So jokingly, example, I used to grow up, and I talk a lot about this in my videos and the podcast, is I grew up and I just remember this one gift my mother didn't give me that I really wanted. And it was this Barbie car that I wanted, this pink Barbie car. And I never got it. Until this day, I still remember that feeling of not getting what I wanted. So I always had a belief system that I didn't get what I wanted. And that was a story that I always remembered in my head, right? And so that's what I'm talking about, is even if those things are so small and they stick out to you, they're so important.
And like this is the craziest thing. And this is like, you're touching on something I think is so important to just like reiterate to the world, is that it doesn't matter what the thing is. Like it literally is irrelevant. It's the meaning we give to the situation that causes the pain. So like so I could be like so upset, like 9 or 10 out of 10 that I spilled the water. But if I made it mean that spilling the water means I'm worthless, I'm stupid, I'm not good enough, I ruined everything, I spilled the water in the meeting in front of everybody and I'm ashamed. Like if I give it that kind of meaning, then that's actually the source of the pain. So like, because you go through that thing and you go, oh, I don't get what I want. Like, can you think of how heavy that feels to carry that belief your whole life that you don't get what you want as a human? So it's the meaning. And that's why when we like go into dynamics where we see people we love getting triggered, it's so easy for us as human beings to be like, they're getting triggered over me being like 5 minutes late. Like, why does it matter? Like they should relax. Or it's so easy for us to make these like surface judgments instead of being like, oh, this is something inside of them. And if we can start asking people that we love and care for questions like, hey, what are you making this situation mean right now? Like, what is this about for you? Yeah. Then we get to the underlying things. And then we're actually connecting to people as their human experience and emotional experience, instead of through these invisible walls of like judging their reaction at the surface level. And so it's really important to recognize that and with the people we love and care about.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, because that comes down to what it just triggered in my mind to remember when you said that, is that's what helps us also progress in our communication when it comes to aggressiveness versus assertiveness, right? So when someone responds because you're 5 minutes late for a meeting and they're like, you shouldn't be 5 minutes late. You're always blah, blah, blah. And I trust you and I believe in you. And then what you can do is you can become aggressive and be like, well, then why am I here? And blah, blah, blah. And now you are triggering back, right? So this is also comes down to the communication style, but then what we were talking about when it comes to emotional control. And the thing that I always tell my men is like, remember, when we get into those scenarios, we got to first respond, not react. So reacting is more of an emotional, trigger. And also like we're reacting off of that other person's energy and trying to, what I usually say, like we're trying to change their mind about something when we react, right? Responding is understanding the why,
Yeah.
right?
Being
So conscious,
Yeah.
exact, present, why. And so when I go into trying to define how do we do respond versus react, how do we do aggressive versus assertiveness? Assertiveness comes with also knowing who you are and how this probably moment, the 5 minutes late moment, really does get fire in you and triggering you. But then you go into the respond versus react and you're like, okay, hold on. Now we go into the why. This person, something's going on. Okay, I'm sorry, you're 5 minutes late, but why are you yelling at me like this? Like, why is it bringing this much anger to you? If I knew it would bring this much anger to you, then I would not be 5 minutes late, or I would call you before. Can you just tell me why so it doesn't happen again and I understand where you're coming from? So then when we do that, when we try to figure out the why, that other person on the other side already feels validated and their needs are trying to get met. So then it's a type of like, it's something I've learned. It's like they actually do this in, what is it called?
Communication.
No, when you're guilty of something and you're sitting in a room. Oh my gosh. Huh?
Projecting?
No. It's when they do the interviews. Like, okay, you're a murderer. I'm the investigator, and I'm interrogating you.
Okay.
But yeah, that's what they learn, and it's like it's a way to calm someone else's nerves down and build trust, right? And so that's what I loved when you said that. Yeah.
I love that so much. And I love too, because like one thing, a tool, and it's very similar that I share with people is like, when you validate somebody else's feelings or needs, they calm right down. And it's like, if you can say, oh, I see that you're hurt or upset, and like, what do you need right now to feel relief? Then, and it's like very similar. It's like on those very same lines, because people, they regulate when they feel seen, heard, and understood. And so, and a lot of people too, I notice like they'll be fighting and going back and forth, or people get into conflict. And it's like, a lot of the time, the reason we're fighting and we're getting so upset is because we're just upset that this person we love doesn't understand us and doesn't hear us and doesn't see us. And so we keep getting louder or trying to be right. We're not trying to be right or wrong. We don't actually care about that when it boils down to it. We care about being seen, heard, and understood.
Exactly. And that's also too, when you're in the midst of a breakup and taking space, sometimes you just want to be seen, heard, and understood. And the woman is like, I just need space. I need to find myself. I don't love myself. I don't feel good enough for you. And now we're getting triggered with the anxious attachment and, oh my God, she's going to abandon me. But we need to remember there's a reason before this, because at the same time, I always say the root of relationships, the healthiest relationships, understands that they're still independent and they're their own person, and that their partner tomorrow can choose to do something differently.
Yeah, 100%.
Right.
And sorry, were you going to say something else?
No.
Okay. And I think too, like, it's so interesting because we look from an attachment style perspective and we're like, if only this person gave me all the love I needed, let's say the anxious person, like, oh, if my partner gave me all the love I needed, I'd be fine. And like, but the reality is, like, until we learn to have that relationship to ourselves and meet our own needs and give ourselves our own love, the analogy I give to people is it's like you're driving around with your gas tank on empty, and then you're going to like get to a gas station and get gas. You're going to be in a state of like desperation. Like, I'm on empty. Like, I can't get anywhere. I need to get my gas tank filled. And it comes off and you feel that like desperate feeling because you're so afraid, because you're coming from such a place of lack. But if we can learn as human beings to like be in relationship to ourselves and meet our own needs halfway and have empowering stories in our thinking, and we can have our gas tank half full, then we're like really prepared for healthy interdependence, where like then we can receive and it's a beautiful benefit, but we're not coming from that place of lack and desperation. So we don't actually heal the attachment style stuff until the things that we really need, we're able to give to ourselves at least halfway.
Exactly. So true. Oh, I love this podcast. This is going to be amazing. I love it so much. You shared so much valuable information with the guys and women that are listening. But so thank you so much. Can you tell them where to find you? Maybe some of the programs that you have that they were just like, oh, this is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a personal development school. It has like 35 courses right now. I add 2 new ones every month. I do 4 live calls with our members every week. So like lots of stuff in there. It's www.personaldevelopmentschool.com. And we go into all the attachment styles and the subconscious and reprogramming and all these different things. And then also our YouTube channel, I put a free video out every day, is Personal Development School Thais Gibson. And then our Instagram is personal development _ school as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll put that below in the description box as well, guys, so you can find that wherever you're listening. If you're listening on the podcast, we'll definitely put that below. We'll put her YouTube channel and also her website where you can find everything that that she is talking about as well. And Thais Gibson is amazing. She is really, really good at what she does. It's obvious. And I really trust in your work. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. And you're absolutely amazing. And I'm honored to be here with you today.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. Guys, as always, we'd love to hear from you. Please rate and review this podcast. Please share this with anybody that can benefit from this podcast, that you know it can help. This is one of the best gifts to give someone instead of anything monetary. This is something, I think, by sharing podcasts, personal development tools, and things that people need in life, especially now more than ever these days, is the biggest gift that you can give a friend, a family member, or anyone. So please share this podcast with anybody that can use it. Again, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you guys again next week on our next podcast episode. Bye for now.